This video will explain the method underpinning the ecosystem function mapping work undertaken by the University of the Sunshine Coast and the Sunshine Coast Council in their partnership project valuing the Sunshine Coast's natural assets. The description of the method that we used applies to both the production of the static maps that are contained in the various reports produced by the project, as well as the open access online ecosystem function mapping tool, which I'm going to demonstrate. In a separate video, we provided an overview of the main concepts and terminology related to natural assets, ecosystem services, and ecosystem functions, so please refer to that video for background information where necessary. The ecosystem function mapping tool is the outcome of a lengthy and scientifically rigorous trajectory of work involving multiple organizations and spanning many years. The foundational work that underpins the tool was completed during the SEQ Ecosystem Services Project, which was a collaboration between SEQ catchments, now called Healthy Land and Water, the University of the Sunshine Coast, and the Department of Infrastructure and Planning through the Office of Urban Management in Queensland. Among the many outcomes of that project was the development of a detailed conceptual framework that described the relationships between ecosystem types, the functions that are being performed within them, the services that result, and the constituents of well-being that are underpinned by them. So for example, in this diagram, rainforests perform a wide variety of ecosystem functions, including climate regulation, soil retention, nutrient regulation, and providing supporting habitats. The performance of those functions enables the flow of a wide range of ecosystem services, such as providing us with a habitable climate to live in and arable land to grow crops on. Those services ultimately contribute to various elements of our well-being. The framework encompasses a set of defined ecosystem types, which we're referring to as ecosystem reporting categories, as well as a set of defined functions, ecosystem functions, and ecosystem services. The mapping tool itself focuses on the relationship between ecosystem types, those ecosystem reporting categories in our terminology, and the performance of different ecosystem functions that are occurring within them. It's important to note that the mapping method seeks to assign all areas within the Sunshine Coast region to one ecosystem reporting category. For example, even roads are assigned to a category. In that case, the category is called hard surfaces. You'll note that the ecosystem reporting categories extend into the nearby ocean environments, since many important functions are performed there. For the most part, we use the Queensland Government's Regional Ecosystem Description Database, version 12, to assign the sub-ecosystem types into the 27 ecosystem reporting categories that we used in the project and the mapping. Where the location in question didn't have a regional ecosystem designation under that dataset, we used other sources such as the Queensland Land Use Planning dataset. Now, we weren't able to map every single location in the Sunshine Coast. There is some gaps, so please refer to the mapping report, the methods report that's also available on the website for details. We've also made our ecosystem identification tool available on the website to provide details on that classification process. Of particular importance to the ecosystem function mapping method was the earlier work undertaken during the SEQ Ecosystem Services Project, in which expert panels comprised of more than 70 biophysical and social science experts from academia, government, industry, and civil society developed a system to represent the extent to which each of the 19 ecosystem functions was being performed within each of the 27 different ecosystem types, the ecosystem reporting categories. And that system involved ranking the performance of those functions in each of those ecosystem types on a scale between 0 and 5. 5 being full performance of that function, maximum performance, and 0 being no performance of that ecosystem function. The resulting matrix of scores, we'll hereafter refer to as the expert panel scores or the matrix scores, forms the basis of the mapping method that underpins the ecosystem function mapping and reporting tool. So let's look, for example, at water regulation, the function water regulation. So the water regulation ecosystem function is defined as the influence of land cover, topography, soils, hydrological conditions in the spatial and temporal distribution of fresh water through atmosphere, soils, aquifers, rivers, lakes, and wetlands. You'll note that the expert panel have assigned a score to represent their view of the performance of each ecosystem function occurring within each ecosystem type, or as we're calling them, ecosystem reporting categories. So for example, coral reefs don't contribute directly to terrestrial freshwater regulation ecosystem function, and therefore have a performance score of 0 out of 5. Lacustrine wetlands, on the other hand, are among the most important ecosystem types in performing the water regulation function, and therefore they have a performance score of 5 out of 5. You'll note that water regulation is one of the only ecosystem functions being performed by hard surfaces, such as pavement, concrete, compacted gravel, and similar. To produce the actual ecosystem function maps, first of all, we assigned all of the areas within the Sunshine Coast to an ecosystem reporting category using that regional ecosystem database as I previously described. That produced a map with a 10 meter by 10 meter resolution, so little 10 meter cells, if you will. Then for each of those cells, we assigned the expert panel ecosystem function performance score based on the ecosystem category, that type that was present in that particular location. Now, in some cases, a location was assigned to more than one ecosystem reporting category. For instance, an area might have been identified as a wetland in the regional ecosystem reporting database, but it might have been defined as a park in some other data set. So in such cases, we used the performance score, the higher performance score, if there was an overlap of two different ecosystem reporting categories, as you can see in the diagram there in this example of water regulation. So in the end, the outcome was the production of a map showing the relative performance of each ecosystem function within each 10 meter by 10 meter cell in the entire Sunshine Coast region. Let's look at the water regulation function again in the mapping tool. Now, before we do so, I want to draw your attention to this, the numbers here in the little diagram. So I'll mention that the tool enables mapping of all locations where some level of that function is being performed. So it may only be a tiny bit of performance of that water regulation function in this case, but also there's a capability within the mapping tool to just identify areas where maximum function of that ecosystem function is being performed, so a 5 out of 5 score. So let's have a look at that. So here's the ecosystem online function mapping tool, and I'll go through this in several videos, but right now I just want to highlight, there's a top-down satellite map. Now if I put on, first of all, the over here, the water regulation ecosystem function, and show that in the map, you can immediately see, of course, I can zoom out and show the boundaries of the entire region, but in this case it's going to be more useful if I zoom in a little bit. So recall that the ecosystem function type really is defining what type of ecosystem, the level of performance of the actual ecosystem function. So for instance, here I can see the darker purple values indicate higher performance of a function. So I can see that, for instance, Umatic Dam, a very high contributor to this ecosystem function water regulation. Now I can also, in this instance, I'm showing any different type of performance level. So if it was a 2 out of 5, then it's mapped here in a lighter shade. But it's also possible to just highlight the highest level. So these are only the 5 out of 5 scores, and you can see them now. They come in with this hashing over top of the darker colors, and it's perhaps possibly easier to see, I think, in this one. And it's important to note then, just to recall then, that that is because of the underlying ecosystem function type and its ability to have this higher performance. So if we were to look back in that previous slide, and you can just go back there on your own if you'd like to, you may recall that lacustrine wetlands were a 5 out of 5 in the performance. So if I were to, show you where the lacustrine wetlands are, you can see them now in this navy blue. Those are locations of that highest performance. Palestrine wetlands, on the other hand, were a 4 out of 5, so they're not going to show up in the same way. They don't have that hashing over top, but hopefully this gives you some indication. And riverine wetlands, again, were a 5, so you can see those being hashed there. So this is a bit of an example then about the relationship between the underlying ecosystem type, the ecosystem reporting category, and then the level of performance that's occurring there, and two different ways to map that at an individual ecosystem function level. Perhaps before I go from this example, I wanted to highlight that we can map not only different, individual ecosystem functions, as I've just done there, water regulation, but we can in fact overlay multiple ecosystem functions which are themselves derived from the method that I've previously described. So for instance, if we were interested in water regulation and the function waste treatment, we can put those on top of each other. Perhaps we're interested in soil retention as well, or soil formation. We can keep adding those on. And the method in the background that's occurring there, I'll show you, is to overlay each of those individual functions and ultimately allow the user, if they choose to produce a total ecosystem function map with all 19 ecosystem functions overlaid on top of each other. And the method then in the background there is to aggregate up the performance scores in each 10 by 10 meter cell, depending on whether or not they're actually occurring in any one of the different functions, adding those all up together to produce a total ecosystem function map then that allows the user to look at ecosystem function hotspots within the region. And that's what we're going to cover in another video now.